You made $42,000 last year. Your father made $42,000 in 1980. You both worked full-time. You both paid taxes. You both showed up every day. But your father bought a house at 28. You're 31 and you're still renting. Your father raised 3 kids on that income. You can barely afford one. This isn't about effort. It's not about laziness or avocado toast or financial literacy. This is about something that broke in the American economy in 1980 and never got fixed. Something so foundational that it changed the entire deal between work and survival, between effort and security, between showing up and getting ahead. And the strangest part? Most people still don't know what happened. Let's start with a number. The average hourly wage in America in 1980 was $6.66. Today, it's about $28. That sounds like progress. That sounds like wages went up. But here's the problem. If wages had actually kept pace with productivity, with inflation, with the economy's growth, with corporate profits, the average hourly wage today wouldn't be $28. It would be somewhere near $56. We're not talking about a small gap. We're talking about half. Half of what workers should be earning based on the economy they're actually producing. So where did it go? That's the question. That's the entire story. Because $50 trillion didn't just vanish. It moved. And it moved according to rules that were rewritten while nobody was paying attention. Picture someone sitting alone at their kitchen table late at night. The glow from a laptop screen. A calculator nearby. Bills spread out like evidence. They're doing the math again. Trying to figure out how their parents did this on less. How a single income used to cover a mortgage, 2 cars, health insurance, and college savings. How that was just normal. They're not angry yet. Just confused. Just quietly aware that something doesn't add up. In 1980, something fundamental shifted in how America thought about workers' wages and who deserves what. It wasn't a single law. It wasn't one decision. It was a philosophy. A slow motion rewrite of the rules governing labor, taxation, corporate behavior, and economic priorities. And it had a name. It was called shareholder primacy. The idea that a company exists for one purpose only, to maximize value for its shareholders, not its workers, not its community, not even its long-term survival. Just shareholder value. Quarter after quarter, year after year, no matter what. Before 1980, that wasn't the dominant belief. Corporations were expected to balance interests. Workers, customers, communities, and yes, investors. There was a social contract. You work hard, the company does well, and you share in that success. Wages rose with profits. Benefits improved. Pensions were standard. The deal was simple. The economy grows, you grow with it. But shareholder primacy killed that deal. It turned labor into a cost to be minimized rather than a partner to be valued. And once that belief took hold at the top, everything else followed. CEO pay started to explode. In 1980, the average CEO made about 42 times what their average worker made. By 2020, that ratio was 350 to 1, not because CEOs were suddenly working harder, not because they were generating proportionally more value, but because their compensation was now tied to stock performance. And stock performance became the only thing that mattered. So CEOs had every incentive to cut costs, suppress wages, offshore jobs, crush unions, and squeeze every possible dollar out of labor to pump up quarterly earnings and trigger their own stock bonuses. Meanwhile, real wages flatlined. Productivity kept climbing. Corporate profits kept climbing. Shareholder returns kept climbing. But the wages of the people actually doing the work? Flat. For 40 years. That's not an accident. That's a design outcome. Now think about that person again at the kitchen table. They're scrolling through job listings. Everything requires a degree now. Everything requires experience. Everything is labeled competitive pay, which means they won't tell you the number until the interview. They're applying to positions that didn't exist 15 years ago. Positions with corporate titles that sound impressive but come with no stability, no pension, no bargaining power. Just a salary that sounds decent until you run against rent, healthcare, childcare, student loans, car payments, and groceries. Then it's gone. Then you're back to the same question. How did people do this before? Let's talk about unions. In 1980, about 20% of American workers were union members. Today, it's about 10%. That collapse wasn't organic. It was engineered. Starting in the early 80s, corporations launched an all-out war on organized labor. They hired union-busting consultants. They moved factories to right-to-work states. They threatened to close plants if workers voted to unionize. They reclassified employees as contractors to avoid labor protections. They used legal loopholes, intimidation, and political lobbying to dismantle the one force that had historically kept wages rising in step with profits. And it worked. Without unions, workers lost their leverage. Without leverage, they lost their ability to negotiate. Without negotiation, wages stagnated. It's not complicated. When labor has no collective power, capital takes everything. That's what happened. That's still happening. But there's more. Let's talk about taxes. In 1980, the top marginal tax rate in America was 70%. By 1988, it was 28%, the largest tax cut in American history, aimed almost entirely at the wealthy. The argument was simple. If rich people keep more of their money, they'll invest it. They'll build businesses. They'll create jobs. Wealth will trickle down. Except it didn't. Wealth concentrated. The rich got richer. Corporations got richer. And workers saw none of it. Because trickle-down economics was never economics. It was ideology disguised as policy. And it gave the wealthy exactly what they wanted. Permission to keep everything. At the same time, corporate tax rates dropped. Loopholes expanded. Offshore tax havens became standard practice. The effective tax rate that major corporations actually paid fell to historic lows. Some paid nothing. And that lost revenue? That was revenue that used to fund public universities, public infrastructure, public health care, Social Security. All the things that used to make it possible to live a middle-class life without going into debt. Those things got defunded, privatized, turned into profit centers. And workers had to pay out of pocket for what used to be covered by the system. Back to the kitchen table. It's later now, past midnight. They're looking at their paycheck. Gross income looks okay. But then the deductions start. Federal tax, state tax, Social Security, Medicare, health insurance premium, dental, vision, 401k contribution that they can't afford not to make because there's no pension. By the time it's over, a third of the paycheck is gone. And that's before rent, before utilities, before food. They're making more than their parents did nominally, but they're taking home less in real terms. And everything costs more. Let's talk about housing. In 1980, the median home price in America was about $64,000. The median household income was about $21,000. That's a ratio of 3 to 1. Today, the median home price is around $420,000. The median household income is about $75,000. That's a ratio of 5.6 to 1. Homes have nearly doubled in relative cost, and wages haven't kept up. So, home ownership, which used to be the foundation of middle-class wealth, is now out of reach for millions of people who work full-time. Why did housing costs explode? Part of it is zoning laws that restrict supply. Part of it is private equity firms buying up single-family homes and turning them into rentals. Part of it is foreign investment treating American real estate like a safe asset class. Part of it is decades of underbuilding. But a massive part of it is financialization. Housing stopped being primarily about shelter and became primarily about investment returns. And when that happens, prices rise until they hit the maximum people can borrow, not the maximum people can afford. The entire system shifted to extract maximum value from buyers and renters, not to provide stable housing. And renters? They're trapped. Rent has increased faster than wages in almost every major city. People are spending 40, 50, even 60% of their income on rent that used to be considered crisis-level cost burden. Now it's normal, and there's no way out. You can't save for a down payment when rent takes half your paycheck. You can't move somewhere cheaper because the cheap places don't have jobs. You're stuck, paying someone else's mortgage, building someone else's wealth, while your own net worth stays at zero. Back at the table, they're thinking about their parents again. how their dad worked at the same company for 30 years, how he got raises every year, cost of living adjustments, a pension that paid 70% of his salary for life, how their mom could stay home with the kids if she wanted or work part-time, and it didn't destroy the family budget, how they took vacations, how they weren't stressed about money all the time, how life just seemed more stable. And the question comes back, what changed? Here's what changed. Financialization. The entire economy was re-engineered to prioritize short-term financial returns over long-term productive investment. Companies stopped investing in workers, infrastructure, research, and development. They started doing stock buybacks. In 1980, stock buybacks were essentially illegal, considered stock manipulation. In 1982, the SEC changed the rules. Suddenly, companies could buy back their own shares to inflate stock prices, and they did. Trillions of dollars that could have gone to wages, innovation, or expansion went instead to propping up share prices and enriching executives whose pay was tied to those prices. It's a closed loop. Executives get paid in stock. They authorize buybacks. Stock price goes up. They get richer. Shareholders get richer. Workers get nothing. In fact, workers often get layoffs because cutting payroll boosts short-term earnings, which boosts stock prices, which triggers more executive bonuses. The system is designed to reward extraction, not investment, and it's perfectly legal. Let's talk about healthcare. In 1980, healthcare consumed about 9% of GDP. Today, it's nearly 20%. That's not because Americans are twice as sick. It's because healthcare became a for-profit industry optimized for revenue extraction, not health outcomes. Insurance companies, hospital chains, pharmaceutical companies, and private equity firms all took their cut. Prices exploded. A system that used to be employer-funded with minimal out-of-pocket costs became a system where workers pay premiums, deductibles, co-pays, and co-insurance that can easily hit $10,000 or $15,000 a year for a family. That's a second rent payment, just for the right to see a doctor. And employers? They shifted the cost onto workers. Health insurance used to be a benefit. Now it's a payroll deduction. A huge one. Real wages look even worse when you factor in what workers now pay for health care that used to be covered. The money didn't disappear. It just moved from wages into the healthcare system, and from the healthcare system into corporate profits. At the table, they're looking at a medical bill, something routine, a scan, blood work. The insurance covered some of it, but the deductible hasn't been met. So they owe $2,000 out of pocket. They don't have $2,000. So it goes on a credit card, which charges 22% interest, which means that medical bill will end up costing $3,000 by the time it's paid off. If it gets paid off, this is normal now. Medical debt is one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in America, not because people are reckless, because the system is predatory. Let's talk about education. In 1980, you could work a part-time minimum wage job over the summer and pay for a year of public university tuition. Today, that same tuition costs about $30,000 a year. You'd have to work full-time year-round at $15 an hour and spend literally every dollar just to cover tuition. Not housing, not food, not books, just tuition. So students borrow, and they borrow a lot. Total student loan debt in America is over $1.7 trillion. That's more than credit card debt, more than auto loan debt. An entire generation is starting their working life $30,000, $50,000, $80,000 in the hole, paying interest for decades on an education that used to be affordable. Why did this happen? Same reason everything else happened. Financialization. States cut funding to public universities. Universities raised tuition to cover the gap. Private lenders stepped in to offer loans. The federal government backed those loans, which meant lenders had zero risk. So they lent to everyone. Tuition kept rising because universities knew students could borrow whatever it cost. It's a debt spiral by design. And the result? Millions of workers whose wages are garnished for student loans before they even see their paycheck. More wage suppression. More extraction. Back to the person at the table. They're adding it up. Rent, healthcare, student loans, car payment, groceries, utilities, childcare, phone, internet, subscriptions they forgot to cancel. There's nothing left. And they make more than minimum wage. They have a degree. They did everything right. And they're still broke. Not because they're bad with money, but because the math doesn't work anymore. Let's zoom out. Let's talk about what this looks like at scale. Since 1980, American workers have produced more value per hour every single year. Productivity has increased by 77%. The economy has grown. Corporate profits have grown. The stock market has grown. GDP has grown. But real wages, adjusted for inflation, have barely moved. All that extra value went somewhere. It went to the top. The top 10% captured nearly all the income gains of the last 40 years. The top 1% captured most of it. The top 0.1% captured an obscene share. And everyone else? Flat. Or worse. This is the wage productivity gap. And it's the single most important economic chart in America. It shows the exact moment when the economy broke in half, when growth and worker compensation, which had moved together for decades, suddenly diverged, when the deal was broken, when the system was rewritten. And once you see that chart, you can't unsee it. Every financial struggle, every squeeze, every sense that things are harder than they should be, it all traces back to that gap, to $50 trillion of missing wages over 40 years. Think about what $50 trillion means. That's not an abstraction. That's real money that didn't go into workers' pockets. Money that didn't get spent in local economies. Money that didn't build savings or wealth. Money that didn't fund retirements. It got funneled upward and concentrated. And once wealth concentrates, it buys power, political power, the power to write laws, set tax policy, crush labor protections, deregulate industries, and entrench the very systems that created the concentration in the first place. It's a feedback loop. Wealth creates power. Power protects wealth. Workers lose either way. Let's talk about automation and outsourcing. Starting in the 80s, companies began offshoring manufacturing jobs to countries with cheaper labor and weaker regulations. Entire industries collapsed. Factories closed. Workers were told to retrain, go back to school, learn new skills. But the new jobs didn't pay what the old jobs paid. A factory job with a union and benefits became a service job with no union and no benefits. The economic base of entire regions was destroyed. And the workers who lost those jobs? They were blamed, told they weren't adaptable, told they needed to compete in a global economy. But the game was rigged. They were competing against workers making $2 a day with no labor protections. There's no competing with that. There's only losing. And now, automation is accelerating. AI is replacing not just factory jobs, but office jobs, creative jobs, analytical jobs. The jobs that were supposed to be safe. The jobs that required education. The promise was always that technology would make life easier. That productivity gains would mean more wealth for everyone. Shorter work weeks, better lives. But that's not what happened. Productivity gains went to shareholders. Workers just got fewer jobs and more competition for what's left. Technology didn't liberate labor. It devalued it. At the table, it's almost 2 a.m. now. They're reading an article about the gig economy, about how freelancing is freedom, how being your own boss is empowering. But they know better. Gig work isn't freedom. It's precarity. No benefits. No stability. No protections. Just endless hustling for clients who expect cheaper and faster every year. The gig economy isn't innovation. It's the final stage of labor devaluation. It's turning every worker into a contractor with no leverage and no safety net. It's the logical endpoint of the system that sees labor as a cost, not a partner. Let's talk about inflation. Real inflation, not the official numbers. The actual cost of living. Housing, healthcare, education, childcare. The things you can't avoid. Those costs have exploded, far beyond what wage growth can match. And the official inflation numbers don't capture it because they're based on a basket of goods that includes TVs and phones, which have gotten cheaper. But you can't live in a TV. The things that matter, the things that determine whether you can build a stable life, those are things that became unaffordable, and wages didn't adjust. They couldn't, because wage-setting power was destroyed when unions were broken and labor laws were gutted. So workers are told to budget better. to cut expenses, to make sacrifices, but there's nothing left to cut. People are already living lean, already skipping doctor's appointments because of copays, already delaying car repairs, already buying the cheapest food, already living with roommates into their 30s. The problem isn't personal finance. The problem is structural. The economy was redesigned to underpay workers and overpay capital, and no amount of budgeting fixes that. Here's the part that doesn't get said enough. This was a choice. Wage stagnation wasn't inevitable. It wasn't a natural market outcome. It was a result of specific policy decisions made by specific people who benefited from those decisions. Tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation of finance, destruction of unions, offshoring, stock buybacks, privatization of public goods, erosion of labor protections. Every single one of these was a choice. And every single one pushed wages down and profits up. And those choices were defended with the same logic every time. That markets are efficient. That government intervention distorts outcomes. That workers are paid what they're worth. That wealth creation benefits everyone. But none of it was true. Markets aren't efficient when power is concentrated. Government intervention built the middle class in the first place. Workers aren't paid what they're worth. They're paid what they have the power to demand. And wealth creation only benefits everyone when it's actually shared. The person at the table closes a laptop. The bills are still there. The math still doesn't work. But now they understand. It's not them. It's not laziness or bad decisions or lack of discipline. It's the system. A system that was deliberately restructured to transfer wealth upward and risk downward. A system where corporations report record profits while their workers qualify for food stamps. Where billionaires pay lower tax rates than teachers. Where productivity and wages, once inseparable, now exist in completely different worlds. They think about their parents again, and they realize something uncomfortable. Their parents didn't have it easier because they were smarter or tougher. They had it easier because the economy hadn't been broken yet, because the deal was still in place. Work hard, get paid fairly, build a life. That deal is gone. And it's not coming back unless someone fights to bring it back. The kitchen light stays on. The bills stay spread out. The calculator sits there useless because no amount of calculating changes the fact that the numbers don't add up anymore. $42,000 then. $42,000 now. Same work, different world, and no one's coming to fix it. That's where we are. That's the real reason wages haven't grown since 1980. Not because workers stopped being productive, not because the economy stopped growing, but because the people at the top decided they didn't have to share anymore, and they built a system to make sure they wouldn't have to. The question now isn't what happened. The question is what happens next.